We have been dealt a hand unlike anything the church has had to contend with for the entire 2,000 years of church history. It has fallen to us now to step up and be the one in your generation. Welcome to Revival Radio TV. Jesus commanded the church to occupy until He comes. On Revival Radio TV, we've talked about George Whitefield and the sweep of revival that changed the hearts of the colonists. This was the first Great Awakening, and it birthed our nation. So I've asked myself, what did the other pastors do during the awakening? You hear us talk about American exceptionalism, but what does that mean? And what does the early history of America have to do with revival? It turns out everything. Watch this.
Now, I learned from a founding father named Benjamin Rush that some of the greatest blessings that we enjoy in our life are things we really don't notice most of the time. Benjamin Rush was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. John Adams said he's one of our three most significant American founding fathers. He started the first Abolition Society. He started the Sunday School movement. He started the first Bible Society. He served in 3 presidential administrations. He was the father of public schools under the Constitution, started 5 universities, 3 still go today. I'll keep going. The guy is amazing. And we own a lot of his original writings. We own about 120,000 writings from before 1812. So I've got a lot of his original stuff, including his prayer journals. And he would write down what the Holy Spirit was showing him as he was going through things. It's really cool. And in his memoirs, he talks about how that, as a good Christian, he's trying to thank God for all the blessings he's enjoyed in life. And as he goes through and lists those blessings, it's interesting. One of the blessings he lists, he says, I thank God for all the times I have not fallen downstairs. That's a little strange. Now, I will point out, I just came upstairs over there and I didn't fall and nobody noticed it. If I had fallen, everybody would have noticed it. It would not have been fun. See, it's like when you go out driving, go to the grocery store. If you don't have a wreck and get back home, nobody thinks about it. If you have a wreck and don't get back home, that's when you notice it. So it turns out a lot of the things that we don't notice are some of the biggest blessings we have, like our health until something happens, a job until something happens, a family until something happens. And so in that sense, what we have with America, I think, is one of the greatest blessings that we underappreciate. If you look at where we are with America, and I'm going to show you a bunch of slides here, but looking at America right now with the United Nations, we have 193 nations at the world, at the UN right now. Out of the 193 nations, if you go and look at today and back up for the past 5,800 years of recorded history, and you look at where the nations are, the average length of a nation, the Constitution of the world, is nowhere where we are. Look at how many other nations, and look how often they have constitutions. In the same period of time, we've had one. Look what it would be like to live in different nations and experience the kind of turmoil and instability that is common with other nations. As it turns out, most nations, not only do they have a lot of change and go through a lot of things, but the average length of the Constitution in the history of the world is 17 years. This year, we go 234 years that we experienced this year. Now, we are the longest ongoing constitutional republic in the history of the world. Most nations not only average a new constitution every 17 years, they average a violent revolution every generation. We've had one revolution, we've had one constitution. Nobody in the world is close to where we are. In the same way, if you look at what we have in the way of creativity, we are 4% of the world's population, which means we should produce 4% of the world's whatever. That's not the case. The 4% that lives in America has produced more technology, more cures, more scientific inventions, more discoveries, more medical, more everything than the other 96% of the world combined. Now, I speak a lot of places, including across the world, and I do a lot of military bases, and I was in Germany doing some military bases over in Germany, helping the military there. And I got to stay, look, cowboy from Texas, live out west of here, our ranch is out west of here. So I got to stay at a 5-star hotel in Germany. That's really elegant. You know, it's like castle kind of stuff, and it's just the old world elegance. And it would have been a whole lot more elegant if they would have had internet at that 5-star hotel. Now, Motel 6 has internet here in the United States. We live at a level that we take for granted, and we just assume the rest of the world enjoys what we do. That's just not the case. And it's the same not only with what we see in the way of creativity, but what we see with prosperity. You see, America is 4% of the world's population. It produces 25% of the world's gross domestic product, and it's not because we have greater natural resources. Being from the country, agriculture is a big deal. but America is only number 66 in the world in percentage of farmable land. There are 65 nations with a greater percentage of farmable land than we have, and yet America is number 2 in the world in agricultural production. So we're way down here with natural resources, way up here with production. We take what we have and make it go further than any other nation. That's why this is a phrase known as American exceptionalism. This is a term that was given to us back in 1831 by Alexis de Tocqueville, and it's not a matter of arrogance and pride and, oh, look at us, we're America, we're better than everybody else. No, this is a matter of saying America is the exception, it's not the rule. This is not the way most of the world goes. What we do in America is different for some reason, and it's not just happy accident. If you look and say, all right, who are the leaders responsible for what we have in America? Invariably, we generally go to our political leaders. For example, we look back historically and say, oh, well, you've got George Washington. He's got a whole lot to do with the Constitution in America, et cetera. And you would say John Hancock, the president of the Continental Congress. You could say John Adams, who had so much impact as a founding father and as a president, policymaker. And it's interesting that in 1816, a young man named Hezekiah Niles went to John Adams. Hezekiah Niles, young guy, he's kind of like the millennials of that time period. And he told Adams, he said, I'm writing a history book. And we have his history book, came out in 1822. He said, I'm writing this history book, and I was not there when so much of this happened, but you were. This was 40 years ago for you. And if you can remember back 40 years ago, tell me who you think was most important in helping America become an independent nation. Who was most important in helping America take the direction that she took? And it's interesting, right off the bat, John Adams said, well, if you want to know who's most responsible in America being an independent nation, he said, right off the top, you got to save the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Mayhew, the Reverend Dr. Samuel Cooper. So he starts listing preachers. And of course, you can't forget the Reverend George Whitefield, and you've got the Reverend Charles Chauncey. He goes through and lists preachers. Now, we might know who Whitefield is today, but the chances that we know Chauncey, Cooper, or Mayhew, slim to none. And yet these are the guys that Adams starts saying, see, we don't study these guys today, even though the Founding Fathers point to them. We don't study guys whether they're white or black. I mean, who in the world is Richard Allen or Absalom Jones or John Morant or Lemuel Haynes or Harry Hoosier or anybody else? Names we don't know. Let me just give you an example of why we should know these names and how influential they are. If you take Harry Hoosier was a preacher during the Great Awakening. And at the time he was preaching, he was a partner with Francis Asbury. Now, Francis Asbury, if you know him, that's a huge name for American history, for American spiritual history. Massive revivals all over the United States. Put 300,000 miles horseback, riding from revival to revival, which is amazing. That's 12 times around the world on horseback that he did. So you look at Francis Asbury. Asbury had huge crowds. He said, Harry Hoosier draws larger crowds than I do. Harry's got bigger crowds than I do. Benjamin Rush, the guy I mentioned earlier, Benjamin Rush said, I've heard Harry preach. He said, Harry's the greatest orator I've ever heard. Oh my gosh, you're with Patrick Henry and all the great orators? No. Harry's the greatest orator I've ever heard. Now, what's interesting about Harry liked preaching to kind of the blue-collar people of the country, the workers, and particularly guys that were frontiersmen and woodsmen and trappers and hunters and the mountain men, if you would. And so he really had a ministry among blue-collar folks. And as America expanded and moved to the West, now Harry, when he preached over in the eastern part of the United States and Jersey and in Pennsylvania, et cetera. But as America started growing west, by the early 1800s, these blue-collar guys were going west with America, especially the mountain guys and frontier guys, trappers, et cetera. And so a lot of these guys ended up out in what was then called the Indiana Territory. That was about as far west as you could go back then. And interestingly enough, they were known as Hoosiers because people would look at them and say, you're so different from all the other mountain men. What's up with you? And they would say, oh, he's one of those Hoosiers. It was meant to be dismissive because he's one of the crazy guys. He's a religious guy who fought. But how many people live in Indiana know that they were named after a black evangelist? Probably very few know that the Hoosier State was named after a black evangelist. So here's a preacher who's had huge impact, and most folks today have no clue. They've heard the name Hoosier, but they would never associate Indiana, the Hoosier State, with a black evangelist, and yet that's what history shows us. So there's a lot of influence that we live with today and didn't recognize where it came from. So when you look at Harry Hoosier, let me take you into John Adams. Why would he point to preachers and say, these are the guys responsible for what we have in America today? Well, if I take you to the Declaration of Independence and just point to that, historians tell us that every single right set forth in the Declaration of Independence had been preached from the American pulpit prior to 1763. So if you want a fun homework assignment, try reading the Declaration of Independence as a list of sermon topics. and see how many sermons you've heard on the things that are in the Declaration of Independence, because back in the founding era, that was the kind of stuff we preached from the pulpit. We helped shape the view of government. We helped shape the view of education, of culture, of business, of whatever else, because the Bible deals with those issues. So once you look at the American founding and you look at how even the Declaration was shaped, let me take you to more documents as well. If you get to the Founding Fathers who did the Declaration of Independence, I speak at a lot of universities and colleges, and so I'll put this slide up and I'll say, all right, who do you guys recognize up there? And invariably, everybody can find Jefferson and everybody can find Franklin. And I've only had one college one time where a kid found a third Founding Father. And it's interesting to me that we can recognize Jefferson and Franklin. If I start over here on the left, the guy seated down, the guy with the brown jacket and the yellow vest, that's Benjamin Harrison. Going from there, you got Richard Henry Lee. Beside him is Sam Adams. Beside him is George Clinton. The guy looking backwards, the opposite direction on the front was Charles Carroll. The guy in the light brown jacket is Robert Morris. Beside him is Benjamin Rush. Above him with the hat is Stephen Hopkins. To the right of him is William Williams. I just keep going through the other 54. And I said, never heard those names before. It's interesting to me that we have been trained in America to recognize our two least religious founding fathers. We can find Franklin and Jefferson. We know nothing. Well, all the others were like Franklin and Jefferson. They're atheists, agnostics, deists, really. Out of the guys who signed the Declaration of Independence, not only were many of them involved in church ministry, but 29 of them graduated from what we call seminary and Bible schools. That's not a bunch of atheists that went to Bible school. I mean, that might happen today. It doesn't happen back then. And so you have a bunch of guys with ministry training and ministry involvement, and it's amazing to see what they did. And as you move from there and you look at what these guys did with our documents, because we get to the Constitutional Convention some 11 years later, and you look at the Declaration, you look at the Constitution, they produced a set of ideas that have caused us to be unlike any other nation in the world, hands down. We just look at the stats. You know, for our creativity, our prosperity, our longevity, you name it, we're unlike any other nation. So where in the world did those ideas come from? Political science professors at the University of Houston said, well, we think that if we can go back and read the writings that was done back then, read the writings of the founding era, if we see who they quote, we'll know where they got their ideas, which is a brilliant thing. If I followed you around all day with a smart device and at the end of the day just listened to who you quoted, I would know who's important to you by who you quote. So they did that. They collected 15,000 writings from the founding era. They went through all the writings, and in doing so, this is the report that they put out, but in looking at those writings, they found, out of 15,000, they found 3,154 direct quotes. They said, okay, these are the guys they quoted. Let's take it back to original sources. It took them 10 years. At the end of 10 years, they had documented the original source of all of those 3,154 quotes. It's interesting, the single most cited individual was a guy named Baron Charles Montesquieu. He's a French philosopher, wrote the 2-volume set in 1750 called Spirit of the Laws. It's a great book. It's what we use to help get separation of powers in our concept of government. The second most cited individual was Judge William Blackstone. He's an English judge, did a 4-volume commentary on the laws. Great stuff. The third most cited individual was John Locke. John Locke in 1690 wrote the 2 treatises of government. And by the way, here's an interesting little tidbit. The 2 treatises of government, Richard Henry Lee, one of the guys I just pointed to up there, signer of the Declaration, said that they copied the Declaration of Independence from the 2 treatises of government. In other words, that's where they went for so many of their ideas. That 2 treatises of government, published in 1690, we have a copy of it. It's less than an inch thick. It's less than 400 pages long. John Locke references the Bible more than 1,500 times to show how civil government should operate. Now, if I asked you to start naming me the verses you know about civil government, you ain't going to get 1,500. You know, you might get 5 or 10. I've done this with pastors from time to time. I get 5, 10, maybe 12. No, he has 1,500 references to the Bible and how civil government should operate. So those are the 3 most cited individuals, those guys there. What these researchers found that was really surprising was the single most cited source was the Bible. 34% of all of the quotes came out of the Bible. They used the Bible more than any other source, any other influence to create our founding documents. So that's what we have at the founding, is a strong reliance on that. We don't understand that today. But once the Constitution is written, now you have to have it ratified. So we have to send it off to the 13 states, and they're going to have to see if they want to adopt this document or not. And so we had ratification conventions. And so ratification conventions in each state. And if you're going to send a document like here we are in Texas, we send a government document to Texas to be ratified. Where are you going to send it? Well, you're going to send it to Austin, to the state capitol. Yeah, but not so much back then. It's interesting that the ratification conventions to ratify the Constitution back in early America, many were held in churches. For example, in Massachusetts, the ratification convention was held in church, as it was in North Carolina, as it was in Connecticut. Oh, wow, we're going to churches to ratify government documents? Yeah, and then for your ratification conventions to ratify the Constitution, you had to elect special delegates to represent the entire state to come be at that ratification convention. So the people elected their delegates, and strikingly, 44 of the delegates chosen to ratify the Constitution were preachers of the gospel. So ministers are very involved in civic affairs. That's probably not who we would vote for today, because we don't think preachers know much about civil government. That's not the way it's always been in America. It's been very different. So after we get the Constitution done and it's in place, it's been ratified, we now do the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights gives us these inalienable rights that God gave us, 16 to 19 in the Bill of Rights, but these 10 amendments, and they tell us these are the things government can't touch. This is what God wants you to enjoy as an individual. Government can't mess with it. It's interesting that when you look at the bottom of the Bill of Rights, there's only 2 signatures there. One is John Adams, Vice President of the United States. The other is Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg, who is actually the Reverend Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg. He was pastor of a church in New York City. He was heavily involved in politics. He helped write the original Constitution of Pennsylvania back in 1776. And so he's the Speaker of the House of Representatives. The Founding Fathers chose a preacher as the Speaker of the House. Yeah, and that's not unusual, because a whole lot of those who served in the first Congress who helped write the Bill of Rights were also ministers as well. Not unusual for ministers to serve in Congress. Now, it's kind of interesting today, because we're often told, well, the Bill of Rights contains the First Amendment. The First Amendment guarantees separation of church and state. No, it doesn't. First Amendment says you can't limit the free exercise of religion. These guys got involved to make sure government couldn't stop religious activities, to make sure government couldn't say churches were non-essential, to make sure government couldn't do all those things that's been happening recently. And that's why so many preachers are involved. They weren't trying to cut God out of anything. They're trying to make sure the government couldn't cut God out of anything. And so it's a whole different viewpoint. So when you look at what we have historically and what we have at that point in time, it's just real easy to say that if the church had not been involved, we wouldn't have the United States as we come to know it. Now, the church has backed away from that responsibility, but this is why John Adams could point to so many preachers and say, these are the guys responsible. And that's why nobody back in that era, when they were writing textbooks, even blinked an eye at that, because they knew that to be true. Now, today, we're in a different situation. Romans 12, 1 and 2, King James, be not conformed to this world, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. I love the way this appears in the Phillips translation. Phillips translation, Romans 12:2 says, don't let the world around you squeeze you into its own mold. And what's happened over the last several generations is, Christians shouldn't be involved in that area of public affairs. Christians shouldn't get involved in politics. No, 2 things you never talk about. One of them is politics, religion, politics. What are we thinking? I mean, we have bought into stuff. We don't even know our own history. And by the way, this is part of the problem we have with America today. The only reason we believe untruths about America is we don't know the truth about America. If we knew the truth about America, it'd be a whole different debate going on. I'll just throw out 1619 from a historical standpoint. 1619, we're told by the 1619 Project, that's when slavery started in America. Then what do you do with slaves that came to America, with Spanish brought to America when they founded colonies in South Carolina in 1526? What do you do with all the slaves that were brought to Florida in 1560 when they founded the city of St. Augustine? What do you do with all the other, I guess, okay, so it wasn't 1619, slavery started earlier. No, they say 1619 is where it started. But 1619 is not even where it started in Jamestown. In 1619, there was a Portuguese ship, a slave ship that was sailing by. There were some English privateers that attacked that ship, and the stuff back then was English privateers, kind of like pirates, except they do it for the government. So they attack that ship. They take everything off that Portuguese ship. They divide it among the English ships, and there were slaves on that Portuguese ship, and they said, well, we divide the slaves, and they had 19 to 20 slaves on this English ship. The English ship said, we don't want slaves. What are you going to do with this? So they brought the slaves to Jamestown. They brought them ashore at Jamestown in 1619. Yeah, but slavery was illegal in Jamestown in 1619. So what'd they do? There's 19 or 20 people. It's debated whether it's 19 or 20. There's 19 or 20 people that said, look, we don't have slaves, and we're not going to have slaves. Here's what we'll do. We'll make you indentured servants, which is what everybody else in the colony is. Whether you were white or black, the way you got there, it's real simple. You say, hey, I want to go to the moon with SpaceX. Elon Musk, I want to go to the moon. It's going to cost me $1 million. Well, Well, I think my income is worth $150,000 a year. So what I'll do is I'll work 7 years for you if you'll send me to the moon. I'll just, whatever you want me to do, Elon, for 7 years, I work for you. And that's how I would pay off the loan. So they want to come to America. They say, well, you got the ship passage, and then you're going to have food and lodging and place to stay. We think we'll loan you the money to do that, but it's going to take you about 7 years to pay it back. So an indentured servant is paying off a loan within 7 years is what it amounts to. And what's interesting is in Virginia, once they'd put in those 7 years, they not only freed them, they all gave them land. They were all free landowners at the end of 7 years. Now, that doesn't sound like slavery. Well, they were slaves for 7 years. No, they weren't, but let's just say they were. Let's say they were slaves for 7 years. What if they had ended up going to where they were headed, which is to Cuba and to Brazil and that area? They'd probably be dead in 7 years because slavery was so brutal in those areas. They'd probably be dead. So, all right, so those guys didn't end up being slaves. Well, one of those 19 or 20 was a guy named Anthony Johnson. Anthony Johnson became very prosperous, became a very large landowner, and as he was growing and his estate was growing and his property was growing, he sponsored a lot of people to come to America as indentured servants. I will pay for your fare to come to America. You can be here. You can be a free landowner like I am. Work for me 7 years, and you get it. And so that was going on. That's what he was doing. And one of the guys that he sponsored to come here was a guy named John Kaser. And John Kaser was another black man. Anthony was a black man. And John Kaser apparently wasn't a very good worker. Apparently had a big streak of laziness in him. And so what happened was Anthony Johnson went to the Virginia courts and said, hey, this guy is worthless. I'm going to lose all my investment because he's not working worth anything. Would you just let me own this guy for the rest of his life? If he works for the rest of his life, I think maybe he'll pay off what I loaned him. And they said, sure, you can own the guy for the rest of his life. The first case of slavery, of chattel slavery in America was in 1653. It wasn't Jamestown, but it was when a black man sued to own another black man. Now, that's not part of the 1619 narrative. We may not like that, but that is the story. And I'm not saying that slavery was a black issue. I'm saying slavery is a human issue. It occurs with all people, everywhere, and only say that it's white versus black. What do you do with the fact that in the 16th century there were more white slaves in the world than there were black slaves? What do you do with the fact that in the 1830 census, as documented by the father of black history, Carter Woodson, who did Black History Month, he documented that in South Carolina in 1830, 43% of free black households owned black slaves, as did 40% in Louisiana and on through the others. That's a high percentage. Yeah, black on black was common, white on black was common, red on black. Actually, the largest percentage slave owner slaves in the United States by percentage was Native American tribes. The 5 largest tribes, 12% of the tribes were black slaves. So slavery is a human problem. So the 1619, if we actually knew American history, 1619, we would laugh at them and say, you got to be kidding. And by the way, where are all the American history heroes you forgot to talk about? Like in the American Revolution, you cannot find a battle in the Revolution where there was not a black genuine hero in there. And on average, in the American Revolution, let me back up. The American Revolution, every battle was an integrated battle, blacks and whites fighting side by side. And on average, it was an all-volunteer army. You enlisted for 6 months. On average, the average black American served 9 times longer than the average white American did. Wow, I never heard that before. And if I take you through the Battle of Bunker Hill and show you the black heroes there, if I go through all these other battles, the Battle of Newport and the Battle of Yorktown and the Battle of Great Bridge and all these other battles, we don't even know those guys anymore. We don't know that blacks were elected to office in America in 1641, as Matthias de Souza was, or that in the founding era, you had Wentworth Cheswell, a black patriot elected in 1768, reelected for the next 49 years. We know nothing about that. And so we hear about how divided America is today. It's going to stay divided if we don't know what truth is, if we don't know something about who we are as a people. And see, that's what happens with this today. If we don't know something about our church history, our religious history, then we're going to stay non-involved in politics. So let me show you the kind of stuff that used to come out of the pulpit. The pulpit was very influential. Let me take you back to the day. We own thousands of sermons from that founding era. Here's one. This sermon is preached. This is by the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Mayhew, one of those guys that John Adams says is so significant. This is a sermon on earthquakes, because they don't have earthquakes in Massachusetts. They did in 1755. See, the belief was whatever is in the headline of the news, we need to cover from a biblical viewpoint. You need to understand how to interpret the news through a biblical filter. So if it's a disaster like an earthquake, or 5 years later, Reverend Dr. Samuel Cooper, the other guy that John Adams mentioned from Massachusetts, You have the Great Fire in Boston. Anything that's in the headline, we're going to show you the biblical application, how to apply biblical principles to that situation. So whether it was natural disasters, didn't matter. If it was something like this, the cry of Sodom entered into. This is a sermon about LGBTQ issues. In other words, this was a case of homosexuality, and it was in the papers, and so said, all right, let's just talk about that. So the pulpit certainly covered LGBTQ issues, which today, that's just nearly never covered. We do a lot of polling work, particularly with George Barna, and talking to pastors, 384,000 pastors in America, senior pastors in churches, and you start asking them what kind of topics are they willing to talk about? What will they talk about? Choose 14 specific topics that we gave them to see. Do you talk about things like immigration? Do you talk about things like education or sexuality or marriage or finances or economics? And go through there, and it turns out only 2.8% of America's pastors talk about those issues, even though those are all issues addressed by the Bible. So that's not a good percentage for the church to be silent in helping shape the way people think about an issue. Another sermon here, this is a sermon on the discovery of a new planet. This is 1847 with Uranus. We have also this sermon. It's actually two sermons occasioned by the late blazing star, sermons on comets. There's comets in the Bible. You have the solar eclipse of 1806. So we talked about solar eclipse. We also talked about a lot of other topics that related to astronomy, and God's into astronomy. As a matter of fact, you go to the Bible, even in Job, you see all these constellations called by name. You have Pleiades, and you have Orion, you have other things called. So God is into astronomy because he's the one who created the heavens. So we believe we should be studying the heavens and see what God says about it, see what new discoveries we make in the heavens. So we were into science as well. This is a sermon on the infirmities and comforts of old age, probably not the most popular topic in the world today.
This is how the early church occupied and was relevant to what was happening with the people. So what about today? So like the colonial church, how do we occupy until Jesus returns? Liberal theology tries to tell Christians how to stay in our box and what the role of the church is. But we're not supposed to listen to the world. So by looking at what actually happened in our nation's history, we can get ideas on what worked and what we need to do again. Faith is all about an action. Remember, the Apostle Paul said in 1 Timothy 2:1, "Therefore, I exhort you first of all that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings and all who are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and reverence." So the church needs a peaceful environment to operate at its best. Well, God created America as a place for the church to have the freedom to operate in peace and without hindrance from a state church or a king that would stop the spreading of the gospel. And this is exactly what the Reformation was all about. Once the church threw off the chains from an oppressive state church, it changed the government. And especially here in America, God created a place founded on biblical principles. Today, unfortunately, the church has forgotten the godly roots and purpose for America. As Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, and John Winthrop drew from that, America is the city shining on a hill. We'll see you next time, right here on Revival Radio TV.